What's up guys, John from S&S Cycle here. This is the first part of our series featuring the S&S Power Package. In today's video, we're going to be installing the 4-inch cylinder kit on this 2007 Dyna FXD twin cam model. We'll also be talking about all the other variables that are involved with installing this kit, but today we're going to focus on the cylinders. So the first things first, let's break it down. Now that we've broken down the top end of the motorcycle per the factory manual, we're going to go ahead and install our S&S 4-inch cylinder kit. A few tools that you'll need to do the install: a ring compressor, a ring expander, a wrist pin clip tool, a oil ring filer, feeler gauge, micrometer, and some brake cleaner for cleaning the cylinders. One thing to note, when handling the cylinders, always have the spigots facing up, like so. The spigots are actually quite thin and delicate, so we like to have them facing straight up, making sure they don't get dinged or marred. Now that we've gone over everything, let's start with the procedure of cleaning and checking everything inside the motor to make sure we're ready to install the cylinders. Before we install our cylinders, we're going to go ahead and check our flywheel, making sure that it rotates cleanly and freely without sticking anywhere. To do this, have the motor in neutral and rotate like so. We're going to do probably about 20 to 30 times, making sure that it's nice and easy, free flowing, and there is no sticking. Now that we've checked the flywheel is free and clear and no sticking, we're going to measure the depth of the inside of the case here for the depth of the spigot of the cylinder. To do this using a caliper, I'm going to start at the top and go down to where the bottom of the case is for the cylinder spigot. And on this model in particular, it should read 1.2500 as a minimum on inches for the spigot depth within the case. And that is for models 07 to 17. Both front and rear have 1.2550. Perfect. We have confirmed the depth of the cylinders is accurate within the case. We're going to go ahead and clean up the case on the top surface here before installing the new cylinders. And then after we clean it, we're going to test fit the cylinders to make sure they slide in correctly before putting the pistons on. So let's get to cleaning. Carefully slide on the cylinder, holding the connecting rod, making sure you don't ding it too hard and drop it down in. grabbing the connecting rod through the cylinder and snugging it in, like so. Perfect fit. And we're going to do the same thing on the rear cylinder. Test fitting it. Nice and carefully. The clearance is a little bit harder over here. Be careful of that spigot. And guide the connecting rod right up the middle. Nice and easy. Making sure it fits in. For the next step in our installation, we're going to prep and clean our cylinders. We've already taken them out of the packaging and cleaned them with warm soapy water. Now we're going to go ahead and clean them with brake cleaner. We'll be using lint-free towels, so you'll be able to see that there is no dirt left over within the cylinders. And when using brake cleaner, make sure to use your rubber gloves and safety glasses because it is a chemical. Also, remember to clean all the cavity holes, including the oil passages and the holes for your case studs. Let's get started. Now that we've cleaned and prepped the cylinders, we're ready to gap the piston rings. Before we do that, there's a few things we're going to do. We're going to take some oil, a slight layer of oil, and coat the inside of the cylinder all throughout. After coating the cylinders with a layer of oil, we're going to take the cardboard rings that were included in the S&S packaging and put them on the spigots. Before we gap our piston rings, we're going to identify them first. The top ring is black on both sides and has a silver edge / face on the shoulder of it all the way around. The second ring is black on both sides, including the edge, but has a slight bevel on one side of the ring. The expander ring is wavy all the way through and flimsy, easy to identify. The oil rings are both identical, thin, and very light. Those will go on top and bottom of the expander ring. Now that we've identified our piston rings, we're going to go ahead and gap them. To do so, we're going to take our top ring and insert it into the cylinder like so. We're going to take our piston and using both wrist pins from the kit, we're going to insert one wrist pin on one side, leaving some room out, and the other wrist pin on the other side, leaving some room out, so we can slide the piston into the top of the cylinder to the wrist pins, like so. Now that we have that in there, this is the top ring. The top ring should be gapped between 0.024 and 0.026. You take your feeler gauge, you insert it, and you make sure the gap is correct. If the gap is incorrect or you need to open the gap, you will need to use a file or piston ring grinder, the appropriate tools. If you do use these tools, make sure to deburr the rings after doing so. Now we'll move on to the second ring. Doing the same way as the first ring, top ring, this is the second ring. We're going to insert it into the cylinder. After inserting the second piston ring, we're going to take our piston, like we did with the first piston ring, slide it down like so, and we're going to gap it. Gapping for the second piston ring is 0.32 to 0.35. And again, note, if you need to open up the gap because it is not gapped correctly, please use the appropriate file or piston ring grinder to make the gap correct. And then make sure to deburr and clean the piston rings before installing them. And finally, we're going to do our oil rings. You do not need to grind these down, but we're going to make sure they're at the minimum of 0.015. Again, remember, never file down the oil rings or the expander ring. Both oil rings are at 0.15. Now that we've gapped our rings, we're ready to install the piston rings to the pistons. One other thing to note is each set of piston rings will be married to each cylinder, so make sure you do one at a time. Now we're ready to install our piston rings to the piston. Before we do that, we're going to go ahead and turn these back upside down so you get them off the spigot. It's best to leave them off the spigot as much as possible until installing them. We're going to start off with our expander ring, the wavy one, and we're going to start working it down from the top of the piston to the bottom channel of the piston. There's 3 channels in the piston for the piston rings. The expander ring should meet up and make a W, and that's how you know the orientation is correct, like so. Now we're going to install our oil rings. One oil ring will go underneath the expander ring and on top of the expander ring on the 3rd channel of the piston. We're going to take the first oil ring and slide it down from the top of the piston underneath the expander ring. We'll take the second oil ring, slide it from the top of the piston onto the top of the expander ring on the 3rd channel of the piston. Just like so. Now you should see the oil piston ring, the expander piston ring, and then an oil piston ring. Now we're ready to move on to our second piston ring. It's going to be installed into the 2nd channel of the piston. On this one, it should say M top, that will be facing up. And another way to know which way it goes in is the bevel goes down. To install this piston ring, we're going to use a piston ring expander. And you slide it down from the top into the 2nd channel. Now we're going to install the top piston ring. This is the one with 2 sides black and the shoulder is silver. The way you need to install it is there is a bevel on one side right over here, small little bevel, little mark. That little mark needs to be facing up towards you. Take your ring expander, same way you did the 2nd piston ring, and slide it into the 1st channel or slot on the piston, like so. We're going to repeat the same process for the other piston and other piston rings. After doing that, we're going to go ahead and put the orientation of the gaps correctly onto the piston. So now we're going to set our ring gaps on our piston after we put all rings within the piston. Top ring gap is going to go up here. Secondary is going to go down here. Top oil ring gap is going to go up here. And bottom oil ring gap is going to go down here. The expander ring has no gap, but it will come together and align right here. Let's go ahead and set all these up. repeat this gap setup for your other piston also. We've went ahead and installed our wrist pin clips on this side of our pistons. To note, the top of our pistons has a bigger cut right here. This is the intake valve relief. This is the exhaust valve relief, the smaller cut. The orientation of the pistons need to be shaped this way when you install. So both big cuts will be facing towards the motor. Now, the only way you can put a wrist pin in is through this side. Let's go ahead and install these pistons now. We're going to start on the front cylinder. What we've done is covered the cylinder studs, the case studs, with tubing, so once the piston is installed, it can rest easily on the tubing and not get marred. Before we install it, we're going to add assembly lube to pretty much everything. So let's start off with the wrist pin, and we'll coat the wrist pin nice and good. Okay, next we'll put a little bit inside the connecting rod. And finally, we'll add some to the piston. Take the piston, opposite side of wrist pin clip that we already put in. Hold it gently and guide the wrist pin into the hole. Now we're ready to install our clip on this side of the wrist pin. Note, we went ahead and put our shop rags back in so nothing can fall inside to the case when installing the clip. After you get the wrist pin clip in, you want to take a flathead screwdriver and push it around, making sure the clip is within the groove and seated correctly. Please repeat the same process for installing the piston on the rear cylinder. Also, remember, the large cut or relief on top of the piston needs to be facing each other once you're completed. Now that we have the pistons installed in the correct orientation, we're going to go ahead and get our cylinder base gasket ready for installation. To do this, we're going to oil slightly around the spigot and then gently roll the base gasket seal down. Gaskets are supplied in the kit. Take a little bit of oil. Like so. Please note, we include dowel pins for each cylinder within the kit. There's a pair for each cylinder. Install these dowel pins once the cylinders are installed onto the motor. Before installing the front cylinder, we're going to replace the gasket that goes around the oil relief with the new gasket that's supplied within the S&S kit. We remove our plastic around our studs. We're going to go ahead and coat the piston with oil all around, including the rings. Once we're done with that, we'll put our compression tool on there, compress the rings down, and put the cylinder on. We've coated the front piston with a light layer of oil on the rings and piston all over, added our ring compressor. Now we're ready to install our cylinder. One thing to note, the engine is in TDC, or top dead center, and it is in gear right now, so the pistons will not move. Take your cylinder, gently line up the spigot with the piston, like so, and slide it down. Once you clear the piston rings, you can disengage your compressor and get it out. Now that we've installed our cylinders, we're ready to reinstall our heads. And before we do this, we're going to make sure that we clean them, remove all old gaskets, and all surfaces are smooth. As you can see, we have already gone through these heads, removing all the old gaskets and double checking the surfaces to make sure that they seal correctly when torqued. Included are some MLS gaskets. We're going to be installing these now. They're non-directional gaskets. You just need to line them up with the dowel pins. Now we're going to install our heads. We're going to start with the front cylinder first. Before we do that, one thing to note, if you're not running the original heads or stock heads and they're aftermarket heads, you want to make sure that you have a good enough clearance for these brass rivets on the ML gaskets, confirming that you have a good secure seal. We're running stock heads, so we'll go ahead and place the head onto the dowels, like so. There are 4 head bolts that you'll be using to secure the head when torquing it. 2 short ones and 2 long ones. The short ones will go on the spark plug side, the long ones will go on the push rod side. Before we install the head bolts, we're going to add a little bit of oil into each bolt and on the shoulder of the bolt. We will hand tighten them into the head. Before we start our torque procedure on the head, we're going to go ahead and snug in each head bolt in the torque pattern. Starting off with number 1, number 2, number 3, and number 4. For our first torque sequence, we'll be torquing the head bolts in the same pattern, 1, 2, 3, 4, at 10 to 12 foot-pounds of torque. For the next torque sequence, we'll be torquing the same bolt pattern, 1, 2, 3, 4, at 15 to 17 foot-pounds of torque. For the final step, we're going to mark each bolt with a Sharpie, like so, and tighten each bolt in the same sequence, 1, 2, 3, 4, an additional quarter turn. It's important to note, with the MLS gasket, you're going to need to do this procedure one more time on the front head. Same thing, repeated over. So we're going to fully loosen all these bolts and retorque the head down. Now that the head bolts are fully loose, we're going to retorque them in the same sequence, 1, 2, 3, 4. First torque sequence at 10 to 12 foot-pounds torque. Second sequence, 15 to 17 foot-pounds torque. One thing to note, when torquing down correctly, there is no reason or no need to use a torque plate to figure out the circumference of the cylinder. S&S machines these cylinders precisely to spec. Once torqued down correctly, the cylinder squishes in and is 100% accurate. Proceed to do the rear installation of the head following the S&S instructions and as we've shown you in the torque sequence, but note the torque pattern is slightly different in the rear, as you see now.
And just a note, and again guys, S&S honed cylinders to best replicate being torqued up to an engine. No need to measure, just follow the installation steps.
Now that we've torqued down our heads in the correct sequence per the S&S instruction sheet, we're going to put our rocker tops back together per the factory manual. And there you have it. That's how you install the S&S 4-inch cylinder kit and pistons. This is our first installment of the S&S Power Package series. Our next installment will include the TC3 oil pump and the 585 cams. If you like this video, give it a like. Make sure to always subscribe to our social media channels, and for more information about our product, check out sscycle.com.